Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here for services on the weekly Sabbath. Hope everybody's doing well and that you are in good spirits as we enter into the festival season. Today I'd like to talk to you about a principle that I think all of you will agree with, yet we wrestle with it because it goes against our nature sometimes to do those things that are pleasing in God's sight. To begin with, I'd like to advance the idea through a commercial that many of you have probably seen. It's a Fidelity investment commercial. I believe that's what it is. I've seen it several times. It probably won't be on much longer, but the commercial goes like this. It advances the idea that a gentleman has been in contact and or in discussions with a lady about his retirement. And he's obviously a little bit younger, and yet he wants to get from this point to that point. And the way this unfolds is that she takes him out and says, we'll follow this green path. And this rather attractive green ribbon all of a sudden takes off and goes in a certain direction, and then you see it winding its way along and it goes to the left. Well, he steps out of the office, he gets on the path, he begins to march along, and he doesn't go very far until all of a sudden there's a distraction to his right. He's walking along the path that takes him to where he wants to go. It's what he anticipated reaching one day if he'll just stay on the path. But along the way, he looks to the right and here's this window. And inside the window is an attraction, or I would call it a distraction. And I think, as I recall, it's a car or it's a motorcycle. It's a type of thing that men are drawn to. I guess if it were ladies, it could be it could be clothing, it could be some other item, furniture, whatever it might be. It could be a car or a motorcycle for that matter. But in this particular case, he's distracted by this item. And the lady he's been talking to gets his attention and says, now stay on the path. Stay on the path. I think that's somewhat illustrative of the challenge that we have in this life, those of us who are Christians, and we are on a path, how difficult it is, in fact, to stay on the path when there are so many distractions. There are so many things we want. There's so many desires we have. There's so many impulses that we tend to want to react to, and yet we have to stay on the path, and it's so easy to get off of it. Staying on the path. Those of us who have been in the Church of God culture for so many years, we are very familiar with the scriptures in Deuteronomy that talk to us about choosing. God challenges Israel, and He challenges us. He says, I have set before you life and death, blessings and cursings. One's good, one's not so good. Life and death, blessings and cursings. And then He says, I want you to choose, well, you're supposed to choose life, that both you and your seed may live forever. It's difficult to stay on the path because there are so many things that get in the way. And today I'd like to talk to you about an idea that I came across reading a book by a gentleman. I assume he's a pastor. His name is Andy Stanley. He wrote a book entitled Principle of the Path. In this particular book, he espouses the idea that there is one principle, yes, one principle that governs our lives, and if we will respond to this principle, that it will allow us to go where we want to go. It will take us where we want to go. And it is important then to acknowledge what that principle is. And I would like to share that with you today because I agree with it. I agree with the principle of the path because it emerges from the text of Scripture. I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit of a negative story in the sense that involves the loss of life. Some of you may remember years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, might even have been longer, there are incidents like this every year, where a family took the wrong turn up in Oregon. And they had intended to take a journey and end up at a place where they would be well taken care of through the night, a very luxurious hotel. But along the way, they got off the main road and headed up on another road, on this path, if you will. And it ended up taking them up into the mountains, and then a heavy storm, a snowstorm, set in. And the next thing you know, it just snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed. And this was a family of 4, a mom and a dad. They weren't all that old. The mom and dad, I believe, were in their 30s. They had 2 children. And the way it ended is that they were brought to an arresting point. By that I mean they stopped. They were afraid of running out of gas, so they stopped the car. I guess they wanted to have a little bit of gas for heat in the automobile, probably thinking that the storm would pass. Inside were two young children, a mom and a dad. They had some baby food and some other essential items, and they were able to just get by for day after day after day. I don't know how many days went by until finally the man, the father, decided to get afoot and to go and try to find help. And so that's exactly what he did. And you might wonder, what about cell phones? Well, the cell phones, there was no cell phone reception there, so they had no access to the out of the area there. My point I'd like to make, as you understand what's happening here, is they were on a road that was safe. It was predictable. It was measurable. And then they took a turn and they went up into the mountains. They ended up in a terrible situation. It ultimately ended with the father losing his life. And when they found him, some days after his wife and two children had been saved by rescuers, he was only about a mile away from a large cabin where he could have gotten help. That didn't make any difference. It didn't make any difference how far away he was. He apparently fell to the intense cold, hypothermia, and he died up in the mountains. Now, the reason I'd like to mention that story to you, that true life example, is because of this. If any one of us had been in that vehicle with them, it would not make any difference what race we were, what sex we were, how good looking you are or are not, how much money you have in the bank or how much money you don't have in the bank. It would not make any difference what church you attended. It wouldn't make any difference what you had done the night before. If you had been in that vehicle with that family, you would have ended up exactly in the same place they ended up. The idea being that if you take a path that leads to a certain direction, you are going to arrive at that destination. Makes no difference, all the particulars and the special qualities that we might think that we have. So I'd like to come back and revisit this question that was raised in the book. Is there a single unifying principle that in fact governs every area of our life? I believe that there is. I think it's okay to call it the principle of the path. I would like you to understand that this is, though it's called a principle, it is a rule that follows you. You do not have to seek it out. It's with you wherever you go. Just like there are a lot of physical or what we call laws of physics that govern us today. You know, most of us don't understand those particular laws and those principles, but they are there. They're acting upon us today. For example, why is it that when you throw a curveball that the ball curves? I don't know if you've all thought about that. Why does ice float? Why does it just sink to the bottom? Why do CDs work the way they do and DVDs work the way they do? Why don't your legs break if you jump off of a chair into the floor? Why don't your legs break? What keeps a bicycle moving when you're riding on it and it doesn't fall over? I remember when I first learned to ride a bicycle when I was a young child, I was intrigued by the fact that you got up a certain momentum and then you just went forward, you didn't fall over. Why is it that water dissolves certain substances but it doesn't dissolve others? Now, all of us understand those principles to some degree, but you know, here's the thing about it. It doesn't make any difference if you understand it or if you can explain it. It still happens. It still works on you. It's still there. It doesn't go away. I was struck by one principle that was called Archimedes' principle, and this is the principle of buoyancy. What intrigues me about this is that the principle of buoyancy decides or governs whether or not something rises or whether or not something sinks. It governs submarines, it governs boats, it governs you when you swim, it governs the life raft or a little ring that they might throw you to save your life. It's a principle that is there regardless of whether or not you know it or you can explain it.